for all of us. And it's really nice to have the opportunity to speak about the book as a whole, and I think especially nice to speak about it in the context of Irish studies, as I hope you'll see from the talk today that this has been a project that is quite interdisciplinary, and I think fits very well within the Irish studies field. Just at the outset, I want to just acknowledge two really important sources of funding for this book. The first, the Irish Research Council. So the book was written for the most part during an IRC postdoc, as Peter mentioned, in the UCD School of Art History under the mentorship of Emily Mark Fitzgerald. And also as well to thank the National University of Ireland for additional funding which supported the illustrations for the book as well. And any of you who are involved in publishing, and particularly publishing art history, know that these costs can be a huge burden on projects as well. So that's just a couple of thank yous at the start. So the picture that you're hopefully all seeing here on your screen is a watercolor, a 19th century watercolor, which is the image that is on the cover of the book, and also which I kind of open the book with as well. And so I thought it would be nice to return to it today, just to bring us into this subject and into the research of painting Dublin. This is a watercolor, a large watercolor measuring well over a metre by James Mahoney, a Cork artist, and it's called Dublin from the Spire of St. George's Church on Hardwick Place. So if we begin to, I suppose, look at this painting and immerse ourselves in it, what we're looking at is the city of Dublin stretching out across the canvas in a maze of streets and houses. We see black, almost skeletal watercolor ships tracing their way to and fro across Dublin Bay, coming up the river, carrying goods and people into the heart of the city. We see these hazy blue mountains on the horizon, connecting land, sea, and sky. And as we begin to look closer at the painting, we see this mass of rooftops and chimney pieces separate out into recognizable places. We can see some of the city's 18th century squares, such as Mountjoy Square, Parnell, Marion Square. We see the Rotunda Pleasure Gardens, the parkland of Trinity College, St. Stephen's Green, and then the broad sweep of Sackville Street and the curve of College Green. Looking closer still, we can see these sculptural and architectural features, such as Nelson's Pillar, rising beside the portico of the General Post Office on Sackville Street, now O'Connell Street. The equestrian monuments of William III and George II are seen on Dame Street and in Stephen's Green, and other features such as the Campanile of Trinity College, landmark buildings like the Custom House or the Rotunda Hospital, and at that very 19th century building, the glass dome of the hall constructed for the Irish Industrial Exhibition in 1853, an important event in this mid-19th century point and to which this painting in part responds. So this painting captures the geographical and physical life of 19th century Dublin, a city of the British Empire, replete with symbolic markers of its place within a global network of trade and military power. It's also, however, a record of a city on the brink of change. Though the architectural spine of the city was completed in the 18th century, by the 1850s it was expanding, both commercially with new retail and banking districts, and physically with the development of suburbs to the north and south. We see some of these places that I've talked about already become flashpoints for tensions. For example, the GPO, of course, becomes the headquarters for the Easter Rising. Sackville Street is destroyed twice, in 1922 and in 1916. We have those equestrian monuments later destroyed in a way that is obviously very current now. So it's all of these themes that Painting Dublin explores, probing how through visual art we can glimpse at the experience of living in Dublin through these turbulent years and witness how the depiction of urban life connected artists in Ireland to an international artistic community and tradition. So despite the I suppose, richness of art historical scholarship in Ireland, this city still occupies quite a small place in the literature, maybe confined to a limited range of topics and time periods, most notably to the 18th century. In a recent publication, Finola O'Kane and Gillian O'Brien recently noted that, quote, Dublin's awareness of and knowledge of her own portrait is weak. Most Dubliners can call to mind few, if any, of the great paintings of Dublin. And I think it's important to say that it's not because these portraits of Dublin don't exist. It's just they haven't been shown the same attention, say, as the rural or seaboard landscape. They're rarely shown, and they're rarely reproduced, and so consequently they are little discussed. But we see that this omission in some ways is mirrored in the historical tradition more broadly. For example, in 1986, Mary Daly noticed that Irish historians had, quote, been rather slow to recognise urban history, unquote. Much ground has been covered in the interim, but again in 2018, in an introduction to a special issue of Urban History, Erica Hanna and Richard Butler also note that the dominant emphasis in Irish history has been, unquote, the field rather than the street, unquote, and that can equally be applied to the scholarship of Irish art. From the outset, I just want to set a few kind of parameters for this research, because there is things that it doesn't do. Despite, I suppose, my title today that we're exploring Ireland's urban art history, my research has only focused on the depiction of one city, and other cities, especially Belfast and Cork, have very rich traditions of urban representation, and so there is great scope for a comparative study there. And additionally, I have really focused on the work of 6 artists, and it's their output that will shape the rest of my talk today. There are many others who drew, who painted, created prints or photographs of Dublin during this period. But what I hope that these 6 show is a range of different backgrounds, so in terms of social background, class, artists who are working in different styles and at different points in the city's history. In general, though it's not an exact art, the book kind of roughly takes that period from 1886 with the failure of the Home Rule Bill to the, I suppose, the establishment of the Republic through active legislation in 1949, and that sense of excitement that's captured in this photograph by Larry Burrows. I'm not going to elaborate too much on the social and political events that occur between these 2 dates. I think you're all probably very familiar with them. But I just want to say that all of these historical moments and shifts are visible within the city's painted record. So to give 2 examples, we could look to something like this painting, which is in the National Gallery's collection by Richard Thomas Moynihan, The Death of the Queen, painted around 1901, but reacting to the death of Queen Victoria. Moynihan was well known as being kind of a unionist cartoonist, but also a painter as well, a portrait and scene painter. Here we have this painting of quite a sentimental high Victorian painting of the newspaper boy kneeling with a bunch of flowers next to the newspaper that says the death of the Queen. And, you know, we have the symbolism of Trinity, of the former entrance to the House of Lords. So, you know, that is the Dublin as the loyal city. Whereas if we look to something like this, a much smaller sketch in watercolor and pastel by Edmund Del Reyn, showing the GPO in 1916, with the destruction of much of Sackville Street. We have the suggestion of the flag of the Republic flying on a level with Nelson on the pillar. And it's artists like Del Reyn who, of course, also remind us that of this kind of global context. Del Reyn was a Belgian refugee artist who came to Dublin to escape the war, only to find himself back in the centre of another conflict. And also something just to bear in mind is that, although rarely addressed by artists in any meaningful way. The ongoing social crises of poverty, housing and poor sanitation and living conditions for much of the city's citizens must also be kind of held in mind. That is a very, I suppose, general and necessarily short introduction to just some of the issues that kind of crop up in the book, and things that I think I've been trying to hold in almost in balance in my mind while working on the project. So, having really thought about what I would like to use the time today to talk to you about, I am going to attempt to introduce you to the 6 artists that are looked at in this book, but focusing on 1 or 2 key works or themes or ideas in their work that illustrates the interdisciplinary potential of this area of research, probably most importantly for the art and urban historian, but also with relevance to those in literary studies as well, because it's really at these conjunction of the 3 fields that I think there's great scope for Irish studies more generally. So the first of these artists, who will certainly be familiar to many of you here today, but perhaps not to all, is Walter Osborne, who we see here in this wonderful photograph taken in his studio in Rathmines, showing this very dapper artist with his work behind him. Osborne was the son of William Osborne, an animal painter, and they had worked from their home on Castlewood Avenue, as I said. They were very much involved in the kind of Rathmines intelligentsia, who were mainly well-to-do, predominantly Protestant professionals working in kind of scholarly pursuits, medical, legal kind of circles, with political opinions raging across unionism, support for home rule, and nationalism. Like many of his generation, Osborne was trained in Ireland, Belgium, and travelled extensively in France and Britain, looking at the possibilities of naturalism and this way of capturing the countryside and urban scenes as well, through quite muted palettes of grey and blues, relieved by touches of pink and gold. Artists like Osborne were also open to embracing new ways of working, looking to new developments in photography as a source and guide for compositions, as we're going to see with Osborne's work. So let's take a look at a painting by Osborne. We know from a number of diaries that survive from Osborne that he travelled weekly from his home on Castlewood Avenue to attend services in St. Patrick's Cathedral. And this area around the cathedral became very important for his work as a Dublin painter. We know from, say, other descriptions of this area from the 1850s, for example, that by Charles Dickens, that this was quite a rundown area of Dublin, but yet it had something that drew artists and writers to it. So near this painting, near St. Patrick's Close and Old Dublin Street, was Osborne's first foray into painting the area. And we're standing on the street looking down towards the cathedral with these street markets and kind of higgledy-piggledy shop fronts kind of capturing our attention. The young boy with the tin whistle at the front kind of captures the eye and then guides us through. And we're going to come back in a moment to the place of children within Osborne's work. So we know that Osborne was going to this part of the city from his diaries. We have sketches from around the area, but also in his papers are 3 photographs of this street. And this is just one of them here. This is from the Walter Osborne archive, again in the National Gallery. These photographs are small, they're printed on thin brown paper and contain no stamps or marks to suggest that they were taken by a professional studio. Instead, it's most likely they were taken by an amateur photographer, if not by the artist himself. And this is the photograph of the series that bears the strongest resemblance to the painting. And we see here directly how Osborne was translating elements of the photographs into his work. So I'm hoping I can, yes, I hope you can see this. The bag here on the photograph that's kind of bulging out here has been brought into the foreground of the painting, and also this very distinctive kind of hipped roof here again we see. Now you can see even, you know, Osborne, he's altering the perspective of the scene, bringing the cathedral forward. And I think what's interesting about using sources like these is we see what he has translated, but also what he has changed. So again, if we look at the photograph on the down along the right hand side of the photograph, we see things like this hoarding here, perhaps around a ruined house, and then this flat kind of lower facade here. It doesn't meet these other roofs. It almost seems like Osborne has not only lowered the roof line generally, but also instead he's added in these two gable ends, the Dutch billy housing that was very common around this area. So Osborne, it's, I suppose, this theme that we need to, when we can both see these as ways of looking into the city of the past, there's always this element of artistic license and exchange, and that runs through the artists I'm going to look at today. So I mentioned about the child, and actually when we think about Osborne in an urban context, we do get this really interesting sense of his interactions with children, and particularly impoverished children in the city, through his urban paintings as well. So this is a beautiful small painting, one of several he did of children, usually in his studio, and I hope you'll kind of see that these prints on the wall, the kind of ephemera around them, they're quite similar to what we saw in that opening photograph of Osborne. And those of you kind of from an art history background will also recognise this theme of the child blowing bubbles as something that comes from earlier pre-Raphaelite painting as well. But who were these children that Osborne was painting? When we look in the Irish context, there's been a very limited study of artist models, and that's really because of the lack of records that we have about them. But again, in Osborne's diaries, we have this rare and important source of information, particularly in his diary from 1892. And at the back of this pocket-sized notebook are the names and addresses of some of the models used by the artist, which include two boys aged 10, Thomas Walsh and Louis Mark Antonio, and four other models, Michael O'Neill, Katie Kane, Maggie Kavanagh, and Mary Brophy. And so the details of these models used by Osborne show that he sought out what we might call like authentic sitters for his paintings of the Dublin poor. He also gives us their addresses, so we can get a sense here. This is Osborne's home on Castlewood Avenue here, and then these are the addresses of just some of the models listed in that diary. So these children are by and large coming from tenement areas, and obviously working as a model was a way, perhaps, or we hope, of making some money as well. This practice of using models from poor backgrounds was very common at the time, and we can see numerous examples among Osborne's peers and contemporaries. For example, in France, the work of Jules Adler, or in London, Edward Linney Sanborn, or even Dorothy Tennant as well. There's an interesting aspect to this work. These paintings of impoverished children tend to kind of play on contemporary attitudes towards class and sentimentality, and this kind of idea of picturesque poverty as well. And Osborne, so he's definitely playing on that, but also on contemporary debates within Dublin itself, on the role of children in terms of on the streets and the work they were doing, how they were being looked after or not, and that is tied up with other social issues to do with religion as well. So Osborne really does bring us into that world as well. Moving on then, but staying with the 19th century, we have a really nice kind of counter to Osborne, or kind of enriches our study of Osborne, is the work of Rose Barton. And I was so thrilled during this research to come across an image of Barton in The Lady of the House magazine, which is a wonderful resource for anyone studying Dublin or Irish kind of material and social culture in the late 19th century. So Barton was born in Dublin into again, an upper middle class family. Her father was a lawyer, intimately connected with Dublin Castle circles. Her mother is very interesting. Rose's mother had a previous marriage, and her two sons from that, Hugh McCalmont and James Martin McCalmont, would later become very well known in British military and politically unionist circles. As a young woman, Barton's artistic profile develops through societies such as the Amateur Drawing Society, which later became the Watercolour Society of Ireland, and later through the Royal Hibernian Academy as well. But also through things like contemporary newspaper reports, we get this wonderful sense of her social life and her place within that kind of castle milieu in Dublin. She performs in amateur dramatics with her kind of sister, her half-brothers and cousins, and these are attended again by that kind of aristocratic circles. She's presented at court in Dublin Castle in 1876, and again, newspapers kind of describe her clothing, what she was wearing, and it's also likely that she was presented in court in London as well. And I'm saying all of this not to diminish her talent as an artist and her ability as well to make money from her art, but her visibility within the upper echelons of Dublin society was undoubtedly beneficial, as it offered patrons for her work and kind of an almost an in with people who could support her as an artist. So, for example, on 4 occasions, paintings by Barton were purchased by the families of the various viceroys, a fact circulated in the press, largely with the intention of stimulating further sales, but also placing weight behind her name. It seems to make sense then that Barton turned to Dublin Castle as a subject, because, as I say, that's where many of her sales were coming from. So if we look at this painting, which a scene she painted multiple times, this is a version from 1894, called Relieving the Castle Guard. So the relieving of the guard took place during the castle season at the opening of the season, and then at the end of the 6 weeks around St. Patrick's Day to mark the close of the season. And it really was an occasion for pomp and pageantry and ceremony, with military bands marching through the city and culminating with this handing over of the castle. It would have been watched by the Viceroy and his family from the balcony of the throne room, which would be just around kind of here, if we could see it. This painting kind of sums up that sense of patronage that Barton would have gotten from the castle. This painting was firstly in the possession of Viscount Lord Wolseley, who actually was part of the ceremony in 1894, the year it was painted, and then into the family of Lord Houghton, who was the Viceroy at the time. So just to stick with this idea of painting the castle and its ceremonies, a work that you might be more familiar, not least because it's actually on the cover of George Moore's A Drama in Muslin in the edition that came out in the 90s. This is Going to the Levee at Dublin Castle, and again we see Barton focusing on the castle and its ceremonies for her subject. Here we see the little troop of carriages going through the castle gate with the controversial statue of Justice here, who turns into the castle and with their back to the city. But this flank of onlookers and those less fortunate looking on at this ceremony, and the kind of bringing together of this painting by Barton and George Moore's book of Drama in Muslin it has been written about by Vera Krielkamp in an essay, where Krielkamp argues that in this work, Barton, quote, reveals a funereal depiction of a social class and empire, unquote. And it connects with Moore's novel because he also describes the arrival of carriages at an event in the castle. And I think it's purely coincidental that the family is called the Bartons. And there is this beautiful kind of serendipity between the work of Rose Barton and George Moore, is that they're both interested in Impressionism, both artistic and literary, and really the description that Moore gives really chimes with this work by Barton. In this work, Barton views the line of carriages from a slight elevation, placing the viewer above both the participants and the carriages. And so we have this sense of looking on, from this almost kind of omnipotent view. She has, we compare it to a kind of roughly contemporary photograph. She has altered the streetscape, much like Osborne, to enhance the grandeur of the gate and the surrounding buildings, and really reducing the quite imposing black railings on either side of the gate. And I think it's interesting to think about Creelkamp's argument in terms of this painting and the other sources, because I wonder if, as a participant in the rituals of the castle and coming from a generally unionist-leaning family, would Barton have shared a view of this painting as funereal and rather seen it as an important depiction of ritual within the Dublin society season. So again, giving us things to think about in different ways. So I'm just going to take a sip of water. And we're going to move in to the 20th century and to an artist who, again, I think most people will be familiar with, and that is Jack B. Yates. I really like having an image of the artist to show you, so we can kind of imagine them within the city and going about their work. And this is a particularly dapper portrait of Yates, who Nicholas spoke so eloquently about last week as well. And this was taken in 1904 when Yates visited New York for an exhibition there, and taken by Alice Broughton, a very notable photographer who had also photographed William Butler Yeats a year previous. But what I want to talk to you about really with Yates is his sketchbooks. And with these, a kind of connection that we can see between Jack Yates and between James Joyce. So in 1925, Lady Gregory recorded in her journals a conversation she had with Jack and his wife, Mary Cottenham Yates, about James Joyce. Jack, she noted, quote, thought some parts of Joyce very fine indeed, though some revolting. That's Lady Gregory, thought a selection might be made, and he says that is what he wanted. Dublin, he thinks, was what absorbed him, his enemy, his obsession. And I think from this, we can see perhaps Yates recognised a kindred spirit. In 1929, Joyce had purchased two paintings by the artist from his exhibition in London, one of which was a depiction of Guinness barges on the Liffey, and later commented that, quote, Jack Yates and I have the same method. So we might think, when we first kind of bring these two together, Yates and Joyce, to think of Jack Yates's later paintings and those kind of beautiful blue fluid paintings that almost verge on the abstract, and the fluid prose of Joyce's later works. But actually, I think there is again a beautiful synergy between Dubliners and Yates's sketchbooks. So Yates kept the sketchbooks habitually in the early part of his career. There are over 200 of these in the National Gallery Yates Archive, which Nicholas talked about last week as well, and also a collection in New York Public Library, and there are also some still in private collections as well. And the sketchbooks from the early part of his career, kind of through the 1890s and the first 2 decades of the 20th century, are particularly inviting and illustrative as well. And we get the sense through them of a sense of his everyday life, little scenes that he notes as he walks around the city, whether it's Dublin, London, or indeed New York. So it's very hard to replicate the sense of looking through a sketchbook over a computer, but I'm going to attempt to do it. I think the important thing to keep in mind looking at these images is that the sketchbooks are pocket size. They're about this kind of size. They would slip into the artist's coat and he would take them out and use them. They have this sense of being held. They're weathered. They're kind of a little bit battered at the edges and held together with these kind of quite delicate rings as well, so the pages can slip in and out. And in New York Public Library, there is this wonderful sketchbook from 1901 that was probably made over several days. But again, we can think of the Dubliner stories and that those sense of vignettes and moments of moving through the city. And Yates takes in, I suppose, all sorts. So we have things like that statue of William III on Dame Street. We see the statue here, loosely kind of drawn, but capturing that monumental sense of an equestrian monument. Again, the curve of the former Houses of Parliament here, and perhaps this suggestion of other buildings on the street as well. And he also marks this little scene, what he says, opposite King Billy's tattoo, so presumably near the statue, showing American and a green Irish flag and a phonograph as well. So he's giving us this sense of the sights and the sounds of the city as he moves through it. He takes us into the theatre, so we have scenes from Douglas Hyde appearing in a Gaelic League Amateur Dramatic Society a production of his own play, The Twisting of the Rope, and he's actually starring in it here as well. And then also into the Theatre of the Mechanics Institute, which would become the Abbey Theatre. And again, we get this broad sweep of the theatre, a sense of what's on stage and these posters around it as well. So again, these little vignettes of life in the city. It can be things like advertising that catches attention. So we have here the Dublin hoarding with advertisements for The Face at the Window, which was a play and later a film. A clothing market on Little Mary Street, and again the sense of the narrower streets of the city, this outdoor clothing stall with these piles and piles of garments for sale. Or then the funeral crossing Grattan Bridge, and you'll have to excuse my very poor attempt to give you a sense of how this stretches across 2 pages of the sketchbook, trying to knit together 2 photographs taken on my phone. But again, you just get that sense of this artist standing quietly, watching maybe the Guinness barges here going up and down the river, and the funeral scene here, and a man taking off his hat as it passes. And this is actually one of my favorite scenes from this collection, a view of the DBC Cafe, or the Dublin Bread Company Cafe, sitting in a first floor window looking down onto Dame Street and seeing the trams and the horses and carriages go by, and this woman here having a kind of moment of respite and quiet in her day. But again, a scene like this links us back into other cultural representations of the city, most notably Ulysses, where the DBC Cafe is a scene of a chess game with a cafe that had damn bad cakes, but also the place where the love affair between Molly Bloom and Blazes Boylan starts. Many of these early sketchbooks serve Yates as material throughout his career, and so often sketches that were made around 1901, 2, 3, 4, 5, he comes back to in the early 1910s when he's producing illustrations for A Broadside, which is a publication produced by his sister Elizabeth Corbett Yates, the founder of the Cooler Press. So, for example, in 1913, in the August issue, Yates publishes this wonderful print of the tattooer shop on the quays of Dublin, and we see the maybe someone working around the port or the quays here, looking in the window at this range of tattoo designs, which have definitely a kind of Eastern or Oriental flair about them. But if we turn to a sketchbook, this one is from 1903, and we see better examples of the tattoos on a gentleman of, or tattooing on a gentleman of note, which have been translated here. This sketch of a dragon we see an approximation of here, and this is in the tattoo shop on the quays. And sources for the history of tattooing in Dublin are scarce, but I did come across some evidence to say that there was, I think on Ormond Quay, there was a tattooer shop that was open on Sundays. And again, it's that connection between the history of tattooing and kind of maritime trade and the quays that, again, is opening these readings of Yates out into this, I suppose, broader sense of Dublin as a city of trade where things are coming and going. And we see that very clearly in this illustration, also from a broadside, but from October 1914, showing the Dublin quays. And we have this kind of maybe a docker or a ship worker here against a background of the kind of quite distinctive low red brick housing and chimneys, and just this wonderful ship's masthead here, again based on sketchbooks and showing a masthead of this South Asian figure with a gold star, his turban. There are several sketches of this masthead. The ship was called the Barcour. So Yates, again, he's giving us the sense that he's very much observing these things on the spot as well. So we'll keep going into the 20th century. And Harry Kernoff, which really, he's the artist which for me, the study of painting Dublin all started. His work is very popular at auction. There are examples in many public collections, but again, he's an artist who hasn't really been appeared in the scholarly literature on 20th century Irish art. And this is a photograph taken around 1921 of the artist in a London photographic studio, and it's in his papers in the National Library of Ireland. And we see him wearing this very distinctive black fedora, which became a trademark, and we see him painting himself into his work, often identifying himself by this hat. Kernoff, like Jack Yates, was born in London, even though we strongly associate him with Ireland. He was the eldest son of Isaac and Kate Kernoff, who were Russian Jewish immigrants who had moved from Vitebsk, which was then part of Russia, now part of Belarus, in the 1890s. In April 1914, so I suppose spring prior to the start of the First World War, the Kernoff family moved from Dublin, or moved to Dublin from London, with Isaac establishing his own cabinet-making business in the city where Harry served as his apprentice. They lived first on Raymond Street and then on Stamer Street, in the heart of the part of the city that was then known as Little Jerusalem, due to the large number of Jewish families living in the area. So the intention very much seems for Harry to work with his father and carry on the business of cabinet making. But he began to take an interest in fine art, taking introductory courses at the Kevin Street Technical Schools before progressing to the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art. And really then from the late 1920s, he takes his place among this kind of new generation of painters working in the city in that kind of post-Civil War period particularly. So after Kernoff died in 1974, John Nolan wrote an obituary for him and hailed Kernoff as, quote, the artist of the workers, noting his identification over many years with the progressive radical working class ideas, unquote. Nolan said that, again and again I'm quoting, in the 1920s and early 30s, Kernoff showed his sympathies with the struggles of the unemployed, his drawings of men without work, the poverty that was around him, and of places of work, showing both his understanding and sympathy for working people. And I mentioned at the start that artists didn't often address these kind of social issues. And Kernoff is an exception for the way that he shows the work, particularly of the area around the docks and the port, without sentimentality, and he places himself very much on the same level as these men and women. We see his identification with the kind of political left in Ireland, as one example, through his depiction of Liberty Hall, which was repeated. He's created several different versions of the composition you're seeing on the screen now. This, of course, had been the headquarters of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union and had played a significant role in the political and social events of that period. This pen and ink drawing from 1928 shows Liberty Hall as this gleaming white building against a night sky. The doors are wide open, people are going in. It is shown as a place for people to come together to work, to study, to train. And we see, for example, little figures in the window as well. Again, we see this affiliation with the political left strengthened through the 1930s. So, for example, in September 1930, Kernoff visited the USSR with the Irish branch of the Friends of Soviet Russia. He had been selected as part of a delegation traveling with Hannah-Sheikh Skeffington and others. And then when they traveled for 6 weeks, observing aspects of life there, including factories, communal farms, museums, cinema, theatre, and ballet. And if you're particularly interested in reading more about that aspect of Kernoff's work, there is a fantastic essay by Elaine Sisson in Era Ireland, I think it is. I can check the reference for you if you're interested in that. But we see Kernoff again bringing this work and this involvement in politics into his artistic work. And the man that we see here in the woodcut, Unemployed, which is he published in a publication of woodcuts in 1942, but also produced this as a sketch and as a painting as well, called Unemployed. This is a portrait of a man called Jack O'Neill, who had also gone on that trip to Russia, representing a group called the Unemployed movement. So he's a very kind of suitable subject for this painting. And we see this protest in the back, or march, with these signs of "We want work." And Kernoff really was drawn to, as I've said, to the river, to the docks, to the port, to bring these kind of political elements into his work. And you notice how even as a child in London, this is in an interview, that he had really been fascinated by these parts of the city. And he says in that interview that, quote, "No artist need go to Brittany or Holland to paint pictures. He will find plenty down by the London docks." And indeed, he found that in Dublin as well. The sketch you see here on the right-hand side, this was reproduced in the Irish Free State Handbook in the 1930s. And it's just a really, again, this kind of very simple, it's just in charcoal and pencil, no colour, so made for publication, for a non-colour reproduction. But the way that he has captured that sense of these hulking kind of ships, this mix of iron and steel, and this small kind of shadow or silhouette of the workers going out in the small boat or coming back to the quay, has a huge impact, I think, on the picture as well. So we're getting there. I know it's a bit of a gallop to go through all of these artists in one go, but I hope you're enjoying this. When we think about Kernoff, and especially living within that Jewish community, it is very much a working and lower middle class environment, but that's only one side, I suppose, of the Jewish history of Dublin, and kind of moving away from that out to, I suppose, a more established middle class family is Estella Solomons, and I've just circled Solomons here in this wonderful photograph from around 1910 of women studying in the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art. We don't know who all of them are, but just to point out, this is Margaret Clark here, the Newry-born painter, and Katie O'Brien, the stained glass artist as well, and then this is Estella. So again, like the other artists mentioned, Estella Solomons, she trains in Dublin, does some time studying abroad. But really, when she comes back to Dublin and kind of through her training as an artist, she becomes very much involved in revivalist and nationalist circles. And while this might be seen to contradict much of her middle class upbringing, she was part of a circle of cultural figures in Dublin who contributed in different ways to the nationalist cause, often in contrast to the politics of their families. So, for example, we see from around 1911 that Solomons is a member of the Gaelic League. She contributes to Gaelic League exhibitions, and I suspect she was one of a handful of Jewish Gaelic League members. She was involved with in 1916, the National Aid and Volunteer Dependence Fund, helping to raise money and donations for the families of those involved in the 1916 Rising. And then in 1917, she joins Cumann na mBan, the Ranelagh branch here, and this is her membership book, which is in her papers in Trinity College. So Solomons, through these circles, as I say, kind of becomes involved in these circles, and with her studio in Pearse Street that I find really fascinating. And again, it gives us a view into these spaces that became so important for the political history of the period, but which we mightn't really know what they look like or how they fit into a wider cultural context as well. So Solomons had first taken a studio on Pearse Street, then Great Brunswick Street in 1910, and stayed there right through to the end of the 1920s, sometimes moving between different addresses on the street. But her studio, as well as being a space where she exhibited work, where she created work, also became both a cultural salon and a safe house for men who her partner Seamus O'Sullivan described it were, quote, or whose, quote, political and national activities had brought them a very undesirable amount of notice, unquote. James Stephens lived at another flat at the same address at this time, number 17. And so Solomons was painting several leading revolutionary figures, creating an important visual record of those involved in active service. We also see these more contemplative works created in this studio space with this small kind of narrow sash window at the top. And again, O'Sullivan tells us that her studio was at the top floor of a tall house and very difficult to get up to on the stairs. So we see, for example, in this painting, Afternoon Tea, this is a portrait of Michael Scott or Kathleen Goodfellow, a great friend of Solomon's, a more contemplative image here of a woman reading. And obviously there are art historical precedents for both of these kind of compositions or scenes. But what I also find really interesting is the way that she kind of brings in these green, white, and here green and orange fabrics into it. And again, maybe just a suggestion of the kind of political context in which she was working too. Those paintings form one part of Solomon's oeuvre, but I suppose what she's really known for is actually her etchings of Dublin rather than her paintings of Dublin. These were frequently reproduced in books at the time. So, for example, in the Dublin Magazine, which O'Sullivan edited, in the Book of St. Ultan, which was produced to raise funds for the Children's Hospital, and then in guidebooks such as The Glamour of Dublin, which came out in 1928, I think, as well. So Solomons was very interested in the etching revival and the potentials of etching as a medium. She had a press, an etching press in the studio in Pearse Street. And so I chose these two particularly because they show parts of Dublin which are either much reduced or kind of non-existent anymore. So Carlisle Court and the Leinster Market. This is just a small segment of the Ordnance Survey map from 1847, and we can see these two places that Solomons was etching. So we have Burgh Quay here, and we're between Delir Street and Hawkins Street, and this is now where Hawkins House is, or the Screen Cinema until recently, and we see Carlisle Court here and the Leinster Market. So I'll just go, I wonder if I go back. Carlisle Court and the Leinster Market. So two little narrow courts within this block of buildings between Dunleer and Hawkins Street. And something that's really interesting about this Leinster Market, which you can partly see down it today, but you can't go into it. This was actually a scene that Walter Osborne had kept photographs of, again, potentially photographs that he took himself. And he wrote in a letter to a friend, do you know the Leinster Market? You know, there are 50 pictures in it. So, well, he never actually painted it. He was obviously thinking about it. And so we have this wonderful connection between artists at the beginning of this time period and at the end, coming back to these same subjects. And something really to note with this, again, is these children and this little barefoot girl who almost blends in to this fruit stand behind, and who you could very easily almost overlook in it. So thinking about Solomons, Osborne and this changing city kind of brings us quite nicely onto the work of Flora Mitchell, the final artist in the book, and who I'm also going to use now to kind of come to a conclusion. Many of you might know this book by Mitchell called Vanishing Dublin, printed in 1966. It's a beautiful book. They quite often come up for auction, but it was only printed in a very limited run. And when the book came out, an Irish woman's diary in the Irish Times printed a small feature on Mitchell to mark the publication. And the artist, then in her mid-70s, commented that, quote, "I am driven about now, and when we get to Wine Tavern Street, it's gone. So too has the Irish House. Where is everything? I can hardly find my way about the city now." So really, Mitchell, even though she had been training and working through the same period as artists such as Yates, Kernoff and Solomons, her work kind of closes off that story with these views of the city through the 50s and 60s. And so say, for example, this work here of Patrick Street, if you think back to where we started at Osborne, we can see the result of the redevelopment work. The street has been straightened, redeveloped. We have the ivy buildings going in, the appearance of the disappearance of horses and carts, and the appearances of buses and cars and trucks. This is one of the buildings she refers to, the Irish House, which was cleared as part of the Wood Quay redevelopments. And on the right here, Weaver's Hall in the Coombe, which had also been depicted several times by Rose Barton as well. And then by the time Vanishing Dublin was published in 1966, this had also been demolished. And I just want to kind of end with just talking about some of the reviews of Vanishing Dublin, because they capture some of these issues that I've been trying to keep in mind and hopefully bring out a little bit in this talk. So many of the reviews compared Mitchell's Vanishing Dublin to the work of the 18th and early 19th century artists James Walton and Samuel Frederick Brockus, with one reviewer noting that Mitchell was the completion of a trio of painters of Georgian Dublin, with the 20th century artists kind of that we've looked at in between kind of disappearing. And then a later review by Gerald O'Flaherty proclaimed Mitchell's book to be, quote, "one of the best pictorial records of old Dublin ever to be published, in which the artist, quote, caught the face and mood of the decaying centre of the city," unquote. Yet in concluding his overview of the publication, O'Flaherty identified an omission from it. And I'm going to quote again, "Something is missing. It is the squalid wretchedness of many of the houses where whole families might live in a single room, and sanitary arrangements were of the most elementary type. Flora Mitchell glosses over this aspect and leaves us not with a Dublin we remember, but rather with Dublin as exactly as we would like to remember it." And I think this idea of altering or changing or omitting things from visual depictions of the city is really important, because as much as I think there is an incredibly strong case for the use of visual imagery as a source for other types of histories and for getting a sense of the city at this time, it is that sense that they are still products of an artist and are still, maybe open to alteration and change as well. So it's using them as best we can, but with that same sense of maybe not quite doubt, but of being careful with them as sources as well. I'm going to finish up there. I'll close off the PowerPoint now, and we have some time for questions. So thank you very much.
Katie, thank you so much for that wonderful paper, which I'm sure will give rise to lots of questions. So, so if you'd like to ask a question of Katie, there's a little kind of hand icon you should see on your screen towards the top. Just if you press the little hand icon and also unmute yourself at the same time, between those two things, that will just indicate to me that you want to ask a question. So, do we have anyone who'd like to start? Or sometimes I can't see hands going up. Katie, can you see any hands on your screen?
I can't at the moment, no.
Well, oh, here we are. Caroline.
Caroline.
Hi, Katie. Thank you for a great paper. So interesting. And I'm just curious to know if Harry Kernoff and his involvement with the communist thread, you know, how did that go down in Dublin? Do you know anything about that? Was it well received? Did he get any flack for that? Did it affect his purchasing power, or did people stop buying his work, start buying it, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think like many artists, people only started buying his work long after he died, unfortunately. Very few people maybe bought it, or not to the extent he would have wanted when he was alive. But I don't think that was anything to do with his politics per se, because when we look particularly in the later half of the 1920s and into the 1930s, a lot of those cultural figures would have had similar politics, and they're looking at these different ways of living and different types of politics, and it's coming through in the nightlife of the city and the plays that are being put on. It's an experimental fringe of it. But no, the thing that he did sometimes struggle with, I mean, what he had wanted through his life was a teaching position at the Metropolitan School of Art, which he never got. And there is a letter that was written to the appropriate minister at the time, and it kind of says, you know, even though he wasn't born here, you know, he has become one of us. So there is always maybe this little bit of a question over, is he Irish enough? And I think that was more of an issue than his political
Interesting.
use.
Yeah. Thanks, Katie. Thanks for a great paper. Really enjoyed that. And thanks for the great book. Everybody buy the book. The book is brilliant. I've read it. 2 sittings. Put it down.
Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks, Caroline. You definitely get your commission for that. Okay, who else would like to ask a question? Well, maybe I could, while we're waiting for some other hands to come up. Katie, I mean, you've been talking about artists who are active over your 50, 60-year period here, but there is some chronological overlap. So I suppose my question is these artists who are interested in depicting urban Dublin, do they interact with each other? Are there particular, you know, do they comment on each other's work? Presumably they're coming across each other through bodies like the Royal Hibernian Academy. I mean, can you say that there's a school of Dublin artists? Is that too strong?
I think that is a bit too strong. It's something that I desperately wanted to find that, because you do see that elsewhere. So say if we look at London in the same period, you have the Euston Road School. In America, you have the Ashcan painters. So even if they don't set out with the intention to find a school, they do kind of coalesce around them, and they'd have exhibitions together and that type of thing. Whereas I think in the Irish context, the artistic world is almost so small anyway, that they did all know each other just from living, not even in Dublin, from living in Ireland and from all exhibiting at the Royal Hibernian Academy, that they were aware of each other's work. But no, there's never a school of Dublin painters, unfortunately. I think the closest we get to it is Solomons has an exhibition with 2 other etchers who all show etchings, some of Dublin, some of elsewhere. And I suppose there's a little bit of a sense of a school of Dublin etching, but it doesn't really form itself into anything significant.
Okay, thanks, Katie. I see Kevin wants to ask a question.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was just maybe I'm overreading an image here, but I wanted to go back to the Kernoff image of Liberty Hall.
Yeah.
And I was very struck by the light and the shadow of a cruciform, kind of crucifix shape. And I was wondering whether I'm looking for too much potential significance in an image, or whether there is any kind of commentary or significance of that falling in the shadow of that building.
Yeah, I hadn't noticed that. I'm just going to open it up again for myself to have a look at it. I mean, certainly in that composition, which, as I said, he does several different versions of, and in some of the ones where it's like Liberty Hall in the daylight, he shows like a little boy in a red jumper looking up like in wonder at the building. So I think there's a very strong kind of symbolism there. But in terms, let me see. Yeah, I'll have to look at it a little bit more, but I think it's an interesting idea, for sure.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. Kathleen has a question.
Yes, hello. I was interested in I'm interested in everything, but particularly in the Jack Yates sketchbooks, which one that you showed is in New York. Have been published? Is there any way to get a hold of the images?
So there is not of the New York ones. I reproduced 2 of them in the book, but they haven't been digitized. There is a lot of copyright complications with Yates, but there is a wonderful book, if you can get your hands on it, that was produced by the National Gallery, I think in around 2016 maybe, called the Jack Yates Sketchbooks, and you'll probably get it from the National Gallery shop, but that goes through the Dublin sketchbooks with a really wonderful overview of what's in them, so that would be a good starting place.
Oh, great. Yeah, the National Gallery has put their mitts on almost every image of Dublin. So we were looking for some images to put on our website with Bloomsday Montreal, and we didn't have access to anything. Everything's copyrighted.
Yeah.
€9 for one little picture. No, it's very, very difficult. Anyway, thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, do we have other questions? Mary.
Thank you very much for that, which I found very interesting, as I don't know very much about the art of that period. But I did wonder about your last point, and you mentioned that I think it was Harry Kernoff contributed something to the Irish Free State Handbook.
Yeah.
And I think maybe I'm wrong, the Yates did as well. So I'm just wondering, what was the relationship with the new state? Did they, particularly in relation to the last point you're making, were they producing a sort of image of the new state that maybe left out some of the not so nice aspects of it? Mm-hmm. I mean, were they consciously doing that, or was that just their own artistic license anyway?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, especially when we look again at the 1920s and 30s, is we see not just the Free State Handbook coming out, but things like the Dublin Civic Week handbooks, and there's a Book of Dublin, and there's a whole kind of series of those through the late 20s and into the 30s. And in those projects, there is a real attempt, I think, to show sites of industry and modernity, public building, but they're obviously commissioned by either the state or by Dublin Corporation. So it's artists responding to a brief to show them. Kind of going to the latter part of your question, it's really hard to tell, because we're basing this on not on written sources from artists or from interviews or anything. It's kind of an interpretation game. But I think part of their maybe reticence to deal with things like showing the reality, say, of poverty or housing and things, is that they're still trying to make a living, and that's something that's very hard to sell. And not to be kind of too mercenary about it, but that is a factor of, what do you want represented in a painting, on to hang on your wall or to hang in your gallery. So that's an element as well. And other people have written more eloquently about that than I'm saying there. But yes and no, and it's hard to tell, I think, is the easiest way to answer that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. We have a question from Tricia.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, I can, Tricia. Yeah.
That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much. And it's great to see, particularly Estella Solomons kind of be sort of given a voice, really, and also Kernoff. And I suppose that's what I'm following on from Mary's question, really, which is, did you do sort of any sort of work in or more research around this sort of coterie of figures that were assembling in Seamus O'Sullivan's house on a Sunday afternoon with the Solomons? I'm not sure if Kernoff went, but Leventhal, and in a sense, they did kind of, even though they had to sell in order to make a living, they did begin to fashion themselves on a sort of liberal elite that kind of were representing some narrative at the same time of a narrowing of Irish identity. And I just wonder, because I thought some of the paintings of Estella Solomons were really interesting, but has any of her work kind of spoken to that? I know Kernoff certainly did, but did Estella Solomons, any of her work, speak to that kind of, those conversations that were arising from these new spaces that these artists and writers were occupying? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think you're maybe working a little bit on Solomons and Kernoff as well. I think firstly, even though they're working at the same time, Kernoff and Solomons move in very different circles. They come from, and I think there's maybe we want to put them together because they're kind of two examples of artists from the Jewish community particularly, but they have very different kind of class backgrounds as well. So I'm sure they knew each other's work and that type of thing, but they are doing different things. There's a little bit in the book, and I didn't go into it here, looking at some of O'Sullivan's writings about Dublin with Solomon's etchings and the kind of shared aesthetic between that's something I'm really interested in, and their portrayal of this sense of maybe kind of an 18th century Dublin or early 19th century, and these kind of the squares and the houses and the kind of more haunting elements of Dublin. I think there's a real interaction there. In terms of their kind of circle of friends, I haven't looked at it that much, but I think it could be really rich to do, especially their relationship, between O'Sullivan, Solomons, and Kathleen Goodfellow or Michael Scott as well, and then obviously the broader kind of the Leventhal circle as well. But it isn't something I have kind of come to yet, but I think that again that could maybe flesh out this sense of a shared aesthetic between O'Sullivan and Solomon as well. So I think Solomons as well. So I think there is definitely something there, and I would love if someone would like to take that on and run with it a little bit further, because there's a lot more to do in that respect. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tricia.
Thanks, Tricia. We do have time for one or two more questions, if anyone would like to ask one. Not seeing any hands go up. Oh, yes, sorry, Maureen, yeah. Just unmute yourself, Maureen.
Yeah, Katie, where would you put Sive Trench?
Sorry, Maureen?
Where would you put Sive Trench?
Sive Trench, oh yeah. I'll be honest, I haven't really looked at her work that much. I know she was part of the same kind of Gaelic League branch as Solomons, and they certainly exhibited together, but that's as much as I can say. I'm afraid I don't know very much about her work. Yeah.
Hilary Pyle did a book on her.
Yeah.
Which you might start with.
I think that's a good place to start. Hilary Pyle also has a wonderful publication that I think is online called Portraits of Patriots, and that's about Solomon's portraits of figures that were coming to the studio in the Safe House. That's wonderful. Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Anyone else? Last call for questions. Or just shout out if I can't see your hand.
I had another question.
Sure, Kathy.
Hi, it's Kathleen Fee. I have never heard of Lady of the House, so I just wanted to have a little background on that.
Absolutely. Lady of the House is a wonderful publication. There are some of the Christmas issues are online, but otherwise it's a microfilm in the National Library or getting into Trinity early printed books at the moment. It is a magazine that was founded by Findlaters, the wine merchants, as a way of selling their groceries to upper middle class Dublin women in the suburbs, but which did become kind of an interesting social magazine that had the usual kind of dress patterns and things in it, but also articles about Dublin's history, articles about like notable Irish women. It's a fascinating, if you're interested in kind of bourgeois Dublin at the end of the century, it is fantastic. And it becomes, I think in around 1910, it becomes Irish Tatler as well.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
And like it has like Bonnie baby competitions, and you can lose days. I have lost days to looking through it to find articles on women artists, which are really interesting in terms of how they're focusing on these women and presenting them, but also getting sidetracked by like serialized romance novels at the same time. And so if you do get a chance to get your hands on a few editions, it's really wonderful.
Oh my goodness, I'm certainly going to do my best. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mary, did you have another question you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I was just really follow up to some of the other questions. You know, that the 1950s and 60s, sort of the period you focused on, certainly in the later part of your talk, is seen as a sort of dead cultural space, or was seen for a long time. And I think with it's not me anyway. But I mean, more recent research is sort of revising that image. So, you know, from what you've done on art, is that the art?
I have it nearly ready. Okay. Yeah. Right. Back.
Sorry, Mary, I missed the very end of your question.
I can hear your phone call. Yeah. Is it a very vibrant scene? I suppose is what I'm asking. Going back in a way to previous discussion, or are these people, as somebody was suggesting, sort of working against what's going on, which is, you know, often depicted as a very, not quite a Philistine culture, but certainly one that was rejecting modern art and modern forms of culture.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so say someone like Flora Mitchell, who's probably of the artists I've looked at the most prolific through the 50s and 60s, she is seen as quite traditional, and certainly not the kind of Dublin avant-garde, because actually what you have at that time is a very vibrant, if extremely poorly funded, artistic scene in Dublin. So it's, you know, when we see artists like Patrick Scott emerging, Gerda Frommel, the 50s is the time of really abstract experimentation in Irish art. And I would look, if you're interested in reading more, there's some great research going on at the moment from people like Roisin Kennedy in UCD, Rianne Coulter, and many others. But really, there is so much more going on in terms of the arts in the 50s and 60s than we have maybe given credit for. And I think part of the issue with that is artists are doing a huge amount with very little. So the kind of dominant story so far has been the lack of support for arts at that time, which is true, but that isn't stopping quite interesting work going on at the same time. yeah, so there's some great new research on those periods coming out.
Okay, we'll take one last question. So I think Eliza McKee. There.
Hi, Katie. I really enjoyed your paper. Thank you for that. I haven't had a chance to read your book yet, but I'm going to. I'm just wondering, do any of your artists that you research get interested in the sort of the clothing of the people of Dublin, what they were wearing, either poorer residents of the city or more elite people, and how they sort of depicted the fashion and sartorial and the city?
It's actually something I would love to sit down and talk to a dress historian about, but I've no kind of evidence of them like deeply engaging with kind of dress history or fashion history, but I think they all do show a real sensitivity to dress. You see it particularly in the work of Jack Yates, not so much in the works I showed today, but in the way he differentiates between, I suppose, the kind of flower seller, the kind of poor women of the city, and then the really like modish flapper type figures. So he's very good at showing like the cloche hat, the kind of mid-length dress, new shawls and things, and I think his awareness of fashion comes from his wife, who was really interested in fashion, and in their archive in the National Gallery there's issues of Vogue, and she's buying things from Liberty and stuff like that. So it's definitely, I think they are quite sensitive to fashion, even if they don't talk about it more, and I think someone like yourself who would have more in-depth knowledge about the clothing of the time would actually get a lot from it, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, we should talk.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we're running to the end of our time. So before everyone disappears, we've heard a wonderful and beautifully illustrated paper from Katie this afternoon. Caroline already mentioned that everyone should go and buy her book. I would fully endorse that. It is, there she is waving it. It's a wonderful piece of scholarship, as well as being very accessible. So before everyone goes, can I ask you just everyone to briefly unmute themselves and just give Katie a round of applause in the traditional way. And also just sorry, Katie, yeah, just before everyone goes, we do have a seminar at 4:30 next week. We've got Dara Curran speaking on the revival of the Orange Order in the 1840s and the Orange Order during the Great Famine. So if that's something that interests you, please join us at that time. We've got lots of other seminars coming up. You can find those on our website. But for this afternoon, thank you all very much for joining us. It's been a great seminar, and a particular thanks to Katie for giving such a wonderful paper.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.